Hi, welcome to Places of Power, Impactful Experiences with Urban Icons. My name is Helen Divyak. I'm an interpretive planner with Think Design based in New York. And before I joined Think in 2017, I worked at a number of heritage sites and history museums, which gave me a broad perspective on what visitors are looking for out of a meaningful and impactful experience with a museum.
I'm Jorge Martinez. I am head of design at Think. I've been at Think for almost 15 years, and in that time, I've had the opportunity to work on projects around the world and different urban settings. Speaking of urban setting, it's a shame that we can't be in Lisbon with you all this year. But for those who are there, é uma pena não poder estar juntos em Lisboa, pero veremos todos para o ano que vem, se tudo vai bem. So welcome.
Yeah, so as I said, both George and I work for Think Design in New York. Think Design is an experience and exhibit design firm that was founded by Tom Hennis in the 1990s. And our practice focuses on the potential of what museums can do, what they can unlock in us, and the connections that they can build between people, between place and people, and of course, connections with our planet. Our portfolio includes a broad range of sites, including the Freedom Park Memorial and Museum in South Africa, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York, the Jordan Museum in Amman, Jordan, Empire State Building, as well as a broad array of museums, science centers, aquariums, and zoos. But in light of this year's topic, the Inclusive Museums 2020 conference topic about historic urban spaces, what George and I wanted to focus on today was how we as exhibit designers can create meaningful and memorable experiences at urban attractions, and particularly iconic attractions like the Empire State Building that have a very strong presence in popular imagination, that can often be avoided or even sort of ignored by locals because of that tension between locals and visiting tourists. So our question was, how can we create experiences where both locals and tourists not only feel welcome, but they feel a sense of connection and they feel a sense of pride? And so in our short session today, over the next few minutes, we wanted to share some ideas and thoughts with you that has been shaping our work. We hope that they will be applicable to your site wherever you are around the world. And we also very much look forward to a follow-up presentation in 2021, hopefully in person, where we can talk a little bit more about lessons learned. So among our very first thoughts in creating these experiences is sharing stories that users can't get anywhere else. So we can read about these iconic spaces like the Eiffel Tower or the Old Town Dubrovnik or the Empire State Building in books. We can see them in movies, but there's a reason why we go to the real site, the authentic place. There's nothing like standing on 34th Street and looking up at the Empire State Building. And there's nothing like being up in the observatory and looking down all over New York City. So when we talk about sharing those stories where you can't get anywhere else, we want to look beyond the facts and the timelines and the superlatives, the highest, the biggest, the oldest, and really get at those emotional stories, leveraging the authenticity of that unique space.
So one of the things that we always incorporate into our work, and is especially relevant to this discussion, as Helen pointed out, is looking at the authenticity of the place and of the site. And one example which exemplifies that approach is the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York. Of course, it's an important site on a global scale. It's shaped world events ever since it was the center of the world, essentially, for that day and since in 2001. And so the site, of course, plays a very large role in the experience of going and participating in that location. So the site and it's the knowing that this is the place where everything happened plays a large role. And the experience is one of going down from street level, down several levels to the area where the towers were once, where they once stood. And things like exposing the slurry wall, which is the containment barrier that surrounds the entire site, is an important part of remembering that this is the location where those events took place and an important place for remembrance. So we often reference back to the actual site, the fact that this is where everything happened, by referencing also aspects of the architecture and how the towers were connected to the ground there, all the way down to bedrock, which is an emotional arrival at the very center of the most significant portion of the experience, which is the memorial exhibit, where the lives of those who have lost are honored and allow guests to learn more and know these people who are tragically lost. So the site plays a very important role in that story. The Empire State Building is another project also in New York, which we'll talk about here. And the important thing about this project, which is a little different, is that this building occupies a singular, almost mythic place in the imagination of people. It's not tied to any one particular event. And the people who come to see it come to see the authentic thing. So we want to honor and celebrate as much as we can the physical building, but also its place and culture. So we really focus on the integrity of the building, its material, the way it was designed, and its place in public imagination. But in 2020, 2021, authentic means making a real place, something that's here now and not themed, not a nostalgic fantasy. So we draw from the history of the building, its architecture, and its physicality. And at the very top of the mast there, we have a good example of where we stripped away as much of the building as we could to get down to the bones of the building, which is the steel that was and is part of its structure down to the rivets. And by stripping away, we create a much more interesting experience in which you can really connect with the city more immersively. But it also shows that story of how it was constructed, how it is that it stands so proudly above New York and connects people back to the stories of its place in history.
Yeah, so similarly, another project that we're really looking forward to kicking off in Ho Chi Minh City and Vietnam is Independence Palace, which was the seat of the Second Republic until the fall of Saigon in 1968. So this is another sort of urban icon that has a strong presence in the city. But similar to the way that sometimes we have to strip back the structure and sometimes we need to know when to stand back. In order to share that authentic story, we need to recognize that there are spaces within these buildings that speak for themselves. We don't have to do the interpreting or the design over them. As they exist in themselves, they tell a story. So here you're seeing this very eerie hallway that was in the basement of the palace. Feels very disjointed from the grand rooms upstairs, but this is where people would have worked during the Vietnam War on some of, the secrets and rushing around. This other next picture of the stairway also gives you an idea of the eeriness of this space, of the bowels of this palace, where again, we just have to know when to step back to allow that authentic space to speak rather than trying to speak for it. It's also a space that we don't know a lot about. So rather than trying to make up stories, we stick to what we know and let the space do the talking. Building on this idea of telling stories where you can't get anywhere else is making sure that those stories are local and making sure that those stories are human. So again, we want to get away from the general, and the general gives the context, but we really want to get to the specific quickly. And those stories that convey emotion, not just information. We know that people remember and connect with spaces through emotion, not just through facts. So the quicker that we can get to those sticky stories about the people who worked there, what they remember, what they experienced, the more that you're going to build a strong connection with your visitor and your site. This can mean playing up personal testimony, oral histories, or even including the clothes that people wore or the tools that they used in these sites. But again, we want to make sure that we're using these sites to share the stories that are underrepresented, forgotten, or even suppressed in some cases.
And few places exemplify that better than the memorial exhibit at the 9/11 or September 11th Memorial Museum, in which the inner chamber of the lives lost is surrounded by exhibits in which the lives can be explored, the stories behind, the stories remembered and shared by loved ones and friends that are contributed and change over time. In the Empire State Building, again, very different venue, those stories of the inner life of the building help to add life to the story, to tell the human side of the otherwise inanimate building, the silhouette, which is those people who worked and lived every day commuting to the building over its long history. Part of that history is the construction of the building. And one of the major aspects of the new experience is going through and experiencing at a one-to-one scale, really, the stories of the people who helped construct the building, the enormous feat of engineering and efficiency that went into creating the world's tallest building at the time. And that story is told at a very human level with the workers and the experience that being there represented back in the 30s.
And at Independence Palace, we're looking to enrich the familiar historical narrative with the stories of the people who actually experienced this space. And that can range from the very profound experiences like the fall of Saigon, when we are asking questions like, who are the people in these photographs? Are they still around? Can they share their stories with us of the things that they remember? To things that are a little bit more mundane, like a bathroom. We all connect with those everyday experiences, whether you were a cook in the palace, or you were the president or the vice president or a visiting statesperson, you still have to wash your hands and brush your teeth. So allowing people to connect through both the very profound and meaningful authentic stories, as well as the more mundane, is a way of creating really meaningful emotional connection. Something we've also heard a lot from our visitors is that they want to be insiders, not experts. So allow the curators and the historians to be the experts. Our visitors don't want to have a deluge of information. Again, they want to feel like they're an insider, that they're getting a behind the scenes peek. And that again can range from a variety of techniques. At ESB, we have.
Yeah, so at ESB, we found out very quickly from user testing that many people who come to the building don't quite understand it and think that it's either owned by the city of New York, that it's just a monument, that there's nothing inside other than the observatories. So giving people a peek into the life of the building and letting them understand the life that the business side of the building has, which is its true livelihood, and the tenants that are there. We provided these little peepholes into well-known companies so that you could see inside, essentially, and see what the offices are like, that they're not these old stodgy offices with wood paneling and the old green lawyers lamps, that these spaces are vibrant, new, that they're active, and that the building has a life all its own, which is something that people really appreciate, because again, it's something that you can't quite appreciate until you're at the site and are there and seeing it living and breathing in front of you. There are also aspects of the building that don't require a deep engineering knowledge, but are very useful and help engage with the story of the building, such as the equipment that used to run the elevators. So the ability for the building to be so tall was really due to its elevators at the time, which were, um, uh, the newest and most advanced. And so we really wanted to give a view of that. So using historic artifacts and reanimating them is a light way to engage with that. We'd also would love to have people look in and see the elevator shafts, which is not something that's possible. So we recreated them and gave people the opportunity to feel like they're stepping into an elevator shaft. In this case, using mirrors and optics um, and other visual tricks instead of actually taking an elevator shaft out of service. But this is the kind of thing that people feel like they've gained a little bit more, that they have more to add to their story with the building, having been there and being able to see inside.
Yeah, and again, at Independence Palace, this is a look at the kitchen that would have fed the palace. And so visitors already can go into the kitchen and get a little bit of a glimpse of what was happening behind the inner workings of the palace. This is where the president's favorite midnight sandwich may have been made, but also where important dignitaries would have had their state dinners cooked. So again, it's that balance between sort of the grand and the significant stories with the everyday stories that we can connect to. One of the key things that we've learned as well is that we need to allow our locals to feel like they have ownership over the space. So rather than guests, they are co-owners. It's the life of the locals that really brings a site to life, that gives it vibrance, and that gives it relevance. Locals are an endless source of new stories. Just when the experts think they've learned everything about a site, particularly an icon, locals always have more stories to tell. And I think we also need to remember that these iconic sites aren't just a place for people and for the locals, they're of the locals. So inviting your locals to be a part of the story, to make them your allies and your advocates, is a really important part of not just being a good steward of the space, but of allowing these stories to come to life and inviting people in.
It's important, I think, to recognize that these urban icons aren't just living in the past, they live in the present too. And so giving locals an opportunity and a space not just to remember, but to contribute and to share their memories is important, such as at the National September 11th Memorial Museum, where the signing beam is one of the opportunities where locals and tourists alike can add to the stories that are remembered in that space. Uh, the Empire State Building, again, you can visit the Empire State Building in Las Vegas. There's a reproduction of it there. It's not exactly right, but it's close. But the real thing is in New York. And why is it the real thing? It's because it's in New York, and what makes that special is are the New Yorkers that are around it, and the visitors too, the people who have come to the building over time. So for these visitors, we also provide an inside look from a local perspective. So we have hosts. There are hosts who are always on site helping guests through. And when those hosts are on site, actually in person, there's also a digital version of the information that they've provided and are happy to share with guests in their own language. So this allows people to take in these stories in any one of 9 languages, but it gives an insight into the city, everything from stories from these hosts that they've experienced over many years and millions of people that they've seen come through, to where to find their favorite pizza or favorite spots in the building that they might otherwise miss.
Yeah, and something that we've learned through our work with Willis Tower in Chicago, which has the famous sky deck at the very, very top, is that part of making locals, your your co-owners is recognizing that they might want a slightly different experience. So at the Willis Tower, we have two different entrances actually. So one that is specifically for the visiting tourists, the sky deck, which is to the left of your screen under that awning. And then that goes directly up to the sky deck. But to the right, you have more of a commercial offering, places that local business workers, office workers, residents can come and gather to have a meal, to celebrate a birthday, to go shopping. Oh, and while they're there, they might go up to the sky deck, right? So you have two different offers in the same site, both at an iconic site, and then those offers are enriching one another. So again, recognizing that sometimes bringing your locals in might be offering them a slightly different experience is part of recognizing how their demands and their expectations might differ and how you can still make them your allies. Something that cannot be forgotten is the basics. You might have the most incredible, significant historic site and story, but if you're not paying attention to the critical things like, do people have enough garbage cans? Are there enough restrooms? Do people know how to get there? Critical wayfinding, so people are going the right way and not crowding streets. All really important. This became really abundantly clear to me while I was working at the Jordan Museum in Amman, and I had the once in a life opportunity to go visit Petra. Now, of course, Petra today is not a bustling urban site, but it once was. And one thing that stood out to me was that they're trying very hard to deal with the number of tourists, but something like an overflowing trash can can really distract from the overall experience of that space. Not only can it distract from the tourist experience, but it also suggests a disrespect for the space, for the people who actually live and work there, that there's not enough space, there's not enough garbage cans for people to be respectful of that space. Similarly, I took a picture of a sign while I was there that I thought was a little bit funny, and you can see in the next slide, if we zoom in, it says, John should have thought about his size and the animal's welfare before taking a ride. Creating partnerships with your locals isn't just about signs. It's about creating systems where your locals feel like that their welfare can thrive in tandem with the historic significance of your site. So creating systems where local residents and neighbors feel like their way of life, their commercial well-being is respected is really, really important. And of course, taking care of the donkeys and ponies that take you up to the top of some of those mountains is critical too.
We addressed that on the Empire State Building as well. Part of the project was in improving the experience of both the tenants, so the locals who work in the building, and the locals who work and live around the building. If any of you have been to the Empire State Building in the past, you'll know that there are often, or were, lines down the street, which complicated circulation. But if you worked in the building, you'd know that that space where guests came in was also the lobby where your business started, essentially. And there was always a sort of traffic jam between tourists and the tenants in the building, and it led to unhappiness on both sides. So part of the project was creating an all-new entrance on the 34th Street portion of the building that then gives visitors a much more generous, comfortable, accessible space, all their own, to begin their experience and to take them up to essentially and eventually the observatories, but to give them a space all their own and still allow them to exit through that historic lobby and appreciate it, but doing so with the needs of both user groups in mind, both those who live and work there and those who are visiting.
And our last thought, our final thought for today was, it's been a very challenging time for all of us, and we're completely rethinking the kinds of experiences we need to provide to our users and our visitors. But there are opportunities here. During a time when we have decreased tourist foot traffic, this is the perfect time to welcome your locals to your site, to remind them that you are here for them, that their story is important. And it's not just about getting visitors in the door. It's about creating those partnerships. It's about building those relationships that will exist in the decades into the future when the tourists come back. And a terrific example of that, again, is the Empire State Building.
And, you know, using this opportunity to try to find a silver lining in what is obviously a very challenging time for all of us is the opportunity, as the president of the Empire State Building Observatory, Jean-Yves Ghazi, points out in media, that it's an opportunity for featuring New York City for New Yorkers. So bringing those people who might otherwise have stayed away when the tourists outnumbered them, bringing them in, getting to know them better, understanding what their needs are, having them feel more comfortable and feel more ownership over these sites. And we encourage you to think about how that might be applied perhaps at your site or at other locations that are equally affected by COVID, or perhaps another pandemic in the future. But using these moments which would otherwise be a challenge in the loss of people coming in from the outside, to focus on those who are already there and to connect with your local audience.
So we wanted to thank you for spending the last few minutes with us. We welcome any comments, feedback, or questions. Our emails are right there on this last slide. And we also are very much looking forward to seeing you all in 2021, hopefully in person.
Thank you, and obrigado. Bye.